The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Miguel Santos rolled out of his thin mattress on the floor. Through the cracks in the wooden walls of his family's modest home, he could hear the familiar sounds of his mother already at work, sorting through yesterday's fruit deliveries. At just 12 years old, Miguel had the kind of responsibility that would make most kids his age complain endlessly. But not him. Every morning, rain or shine, he would help his mother Rosa set up their tiny fruit stand along the dusty road that connected their small Brazilian town to the bigger cities beyond. Their morning routine was like a well-practiced dance. Miguel would carefully arrange the mangoes into perfect pyramids while his mother polished each apple until it shined. The bananas would hang in neat bunches, and the papayas would be sorted by ripeness. It wasn't much, but it was their livelihood, and they took pride in making their simple stand look as inviting as possible. "Mama," Miguel called out as he spotted a bruised mango in the pile. "We should use this one for breakfast instead." His mother smiled, appreciating his attention to detail. They couldn't afford to waste anything, but they also couldn't risk their reputation for quality fruit. It was this careful balance that had kept their small business alive for the past 5 years, ever since Miguel's father had passed away. As the morning traffic began to pick up, Miguel would often wander to the edges of their roadside spot, examining the thick brush that lined the road. He had a secret passion that made him different from other kids his age. He was fascinated by snakes. While other children ran away screaming at the mere mention of serpents, Miguel had taught himself everything he could about them from borrowed library books and the stories of local farmers. He knew every species in their area by heart: the harmless corn snake that kept the rat population in check, the beautiful but deadly coral snake with its distinctive rings, and even the rare South American rattlesnake that sometimes ventured too close to human settlements. His mother worried about this unusual interest, but Miguel had proven time and again that his knowledge was useful, having safely guided several snakes away from their neighbors' chickens. Between helping customers, Miguel would do his homework on a wooden crate behind the stand. His teachers often praised his intelligence, especially in science class, but they also knew the harsh reality. His family could barely afford the basic school supplies, let alone the kind of education that could nurture his bright mind. Still, Miguel studied hard, dreaming of becoming a herpetologist someday, even though he knew the chances were slim. That particular morning felt different somehow. The air was thick with humidity, and the usually busy road was quieter than normal. Miguel had just finished arranging a fresh delivery of oranges when he spotted something unusual in the brush: a shed snakeskin, fresh and nearly complete. He carefully collected it, making a mental note to add it to his small collection of natural treasures hidden under his mattress. Little did Miguel know that this ordinary morning was about to turn into the most extraordinary day of his life. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing with it the full force of the tropical heat, nobody could have predicted how a chance encounter with danger would completely transform the destiny of this poor but resourceful young boy. From the distance, the sound of an expensive car engine could be heard approaching their humble stand, its purring growing louder with each passing second. Miguel straightened his worn t-shirt and hoped they might make a good sale. After all, people driving such nice cars rarely stop at roadside fruit stands, especially ones as simple as theirs. The sleek black Mercedes came to a stop right in front of Miguel's fruit stand, kicking up a small cloud of dust that made him squint. The car looked so out of place on their rural road that several passing locals slowed down just to stare. Through the tinted windows, Miguel could make out the silhouette of someone talking on a phone. Thomas Weber stepped out of the car, and Miguel's eyes widened. The man was dressed like no one he'd ever seen before, wearing tacky pants that probably cost more than their entire fruit stand and a white shirt that somehow still looked crisp despite the humid weather. Weber held his phone to his ear with one hand while the other tried to swat away a persistent fly. No, the meeting cannot wait until next week, Weber was saying in English, his German accent clear even to Miguel's untrained ears. The businessman paced back and forth, his expensive hiking boots raising little puffs of dust with each step. Miguel's mother whispered to him in Portuguese to offer their visitor some fruit, but the boy could tell this wasn't the right moment. Weber's driver had also stepped out of the car and was stretching his legs nearby. He nodded politely to Miguel and his mother, then walked over to inspect their fruit selection. Unlike his boss, the driver seemed relaxed and at home in their surroundings. He picked up a mango, testing its ripeness with gentle fingers. "Best mangoes in the region," Miguel said in his limited English, proud to use the phrases he'd learned in school. The driver smiled and selected a few pieces, paying with crisp bills that made Miguel's mother's eyes light up. This single sale was already more than they sometimes made in half a day. Meanwhile, Weber was still pacing, his voice growing more frustrated with each turn. "The investors cannot. Listen, I flew all the way to Brazil to—" "No, you don't understand." He walked further from the car, moving closer to the thick brush that lined the road. Miguel noticed the businessman seemed completely unaware of his surroundings, too absorbed in his phone conversation to notice where he was stepping. That's when Miguel saw it. Just beyond where Weber was pacing, a slight movement caught his eye. Having spent countless hours studying the local wildlife, he recognized the signs immediately. The dry leaves rustled in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. A distinctive diamond pattern emerged from the shadows, scales glinting in the morning sun. Miguel's heart started racing. The South American rattlesnake was usually shy and avoided humans, but Weber was unknowingly walking right into its territory. The snake had probably been disturbed by all the movement and noise, and now it was coiling into a defensive position. Miguel knew they only had seconds before things could go terribly wrong. His mother was busy helping another customer who had stopped to buy fruit, completely unaware of the danger unfolding. The driver was back in the car, adjusting the air conditioning. Weber had his back to the snake, still arguing about investments and meetings, completely oblivious to the fact that he was just 3 steps away from one of the deadliest snakes in South America. Miguel's mind raced through everything he knew about snakes. He could see the rattler's tail beginning to shake, the famous warning sign that meant it was feeling threatened. Weber's next step would take him even closer to the agitated reptile. The boy knew he had to act fast, but he also knew that startling either the snake or the businessman could make things much worse. His eyes darted around, looking for something he could use. Near the fruit stand lay the long stick he often used to reach high branches when picking fruit. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Taking a deep breath, Miguel grabbed the stick and began moving carefully toward Weber, trying to remember everything he'd learned about snake encounters. Time seemed to slow down as Miguel took those first steps. The fate of this wealthy stranger now rested in the hands of a poor fruit seller's son, and the next few moments would change both their lives forever. "Sir, don't move," Miguel shouted in broken English, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Snake, behind you." His words came out jumbled, a mix of English and Portuguese, but the urgency in his voice made Weber stop mid-sentence on his phone call. The businessman turned his head slightly, confusion written across his face. He clearly wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by a young boy in worn-out clothes. "What did you say?" Weber asked, starting to turn around completely, exactly what Miguel didn't want him to do. "Please." Miguel held up his hand in a stopping motion. "Stay still." The snake was now fully alert, its diamond-shaped head raised and tongue flicking rapidly to taste the air. The rattling sound grew louder, but Weber, still unfamiliar with local wildlife, didn't seem to recognize the deadly warning for what it was. Other customers at the fruit stand began to notice what was happening. Miguel could hear his mother's sharp intake of breath as she spotted the snake, but thankfully, she trusted her son enough not to scream or cause panic. The driver, who had stepped out of the car again, froze in place when he saw the scene unfolding. Miguel took slow, careful steps forward, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate. The stick felt heavy in his sweaty hands, but he gripped it firmly. He'd never actually dealt with a rattlesnake this close before, but he'd read enough to know what to do. All those hours spent studying snake behavior instead of playing football with the other kids were about to pay off. Weber must have finally heard the rattling because his face went pale. "Is that what I think it is?" he whispered, his phone call completely forgotten, the device still held uselessly against his ear. Sweat began to be on his forehead, and Miguel could see his expensive shirt starting to show dark patches under the arms. "Don't be scared," Miguel said softly, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. "Just very slowly, take 2 steps to your left." His English might not have been perfect, but his steady voice and confident manner made Weber follow his instructions without question. It was strange seeing such a powerful man following the directions of a poor young boy. But in that moment, social status meant nothing. The snake hadn't struck yet, which was a good sign. Miguel knew that contrary to what many people believed, snakes usually didn't want to waste their venom on creatures too big to eat. They only struck when they felt threatened and couldn't escape. Right now, the rattler was giving them fair warning, asking them to back off rather than attack. Using the stick, Miguel carefully began to create a gentle barrier between the snake and Weber. He remembered reading that snakes prefer to go around obstacles rather than confront them. The trick was to give it an escape route while keeping everyone else safe. His hands were shaking slightly, but his movements remained controlled and purposeful. "A little more to the left, sir," Miguel guided Weber, who was now taking small steps backward. The businessman's face showed a mix of fear and amazement as he watched this young boy handle such a dangerous situation with remarkable skill. The phone had dropped to his side, the important call completely forgotten. The crowd that had gathered around the fruit stand watched in tense silence. Miguel could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed focused on the task at hand. One wrong move could have serious consequences. The sun beat down mercilessly, and drops of sweat ran down his back, but he didn't dare wipe them away. Time seemed to stretch like honey dripping from a spoon as Miguel worked to create a safe distance between the dangerous reptile and the wealthy stranger. His next moves would determine whether the story would end in tragedy or triumph, and he knew exactly what he had to do next. With the skill of someone far beyond his years, Miguel kept his eyes locked on the rattlesnake while using the stick to create a gentle barrier. He positioned himself between Weber and the deadly reptile, something that made his mother's breath catch in her throat. But Miguel knew exactly what he was doing. "Easy now, beautiful one," he whispered in Portuguese to the snake, his voice barely audible. Years of watching these creatures had taught him that they were just as scared as humans in these situations. The rattler's tail was still buzzing its warning, but Miguel noticed it wasn't as aggressive as before. Using the stick with careful precision, he began to guide the snake toward a safer path back into the brush. The technique required perfect timing. Too fast, and the snake might feel threatened; too slow, and it might decide to stand its ground. Miguel moved the stick in gentle, sweeping motions, creating a clear escape route away from the people. Weber had backed up enough to be safe, but couldn't take his eyes off the scene. His phone had slipped into his pocket, forgotten completely. The mighty businessman, who probably made million-dollar decisions daily, was watching in awe as a poor fruit seller's son handled this life-or-death situation with remarkable composure. The gathered crowd held their collective breath. Someone whispered a prayer. Miguel's mother clutched her apron tightly, fighting every maternal instinct that screamed at her to pull her son away from danger. But she had seen him handle snakes before. Never one this dangerous, but she trusted his knowledge. "That's it," Miguel encouraged softly as the snake began to move. Its muscular body rippled across the dusty ground, scales catching the sunlight like polished coins. The rattler was starting to understand that it had a clear path to safety, and its natural instinct to avoid confrontation was taking over. Time seemed to move like thick syrup as the snake slowly made its way toward the brush. Miguel maintained his position, stick held steady, creating a safe channel for the creature to follow. Sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't dare move to wipe it away. His feet were starting to cramp from standing so still, but he knew he couldn't shift his position yet. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the snake disappeared into the thick vegetation. Miguel waited another moment, making sure it was truly gone, before lowering the stick. His hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, the full weight of what he'd just done hitting him all at once. The silence broke as people began to clap. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Weber's driver was shaking his head in disbelief, a wide smile on his face. Miguel's mother rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace that smelled of fruit and relief. Weber stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, and his face was covered in sweat, but he was alive. All thanks to a young boy he might have otherwise never noticed. The businessman walked toward Miguel, his legs a bit shaky, his face a mix of gratitude and amazement. "You saved my life," Weber said simply, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Miguel with new eyes, seeing not just a poor boy at a fruit stand, but someone with extraordinary knowledge and courage. "How did you know what to do?" Miguel, still caught in his mother's embrace, shrugged slightly. "I like snakes," he said in his basic English. "I read about them a lot." It seemed like such a simple answer to explain such a remarkable act of bravery. The crowd around them was still buzzing with excitement, retelling the story to newcomers who had just pulled up to the fruit stand. Little did Miguel know that his simple act of bravery, born from years of passionate self-study, was about to change his life forever. Weber was still staring at him, an idea forming in the businessman's mind that would transform both their futures in ways neither could imagine. As the excitement began to die down, Weber asked his driver to translate. He wanted to know everything about the young boy who had just saved his life. The driver, who spoke both Portuguese and English, became the bridge between two very different worlds. "How did you learn so much about snakes?" Weber asked through the driver. The small group had moved to the shade of the fruit stand, where Miguel's mother insisted on offering them fresh water in their cleanest cups. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she poured. Miguel's eyes lit up at the question. Through the driver's translation, he explained how he would spend hours at the local library, reading any books he could find about snakes and other animals. "The librarian, she keeps old magazines for me," he said proudly. "National Geographic. I learn English from them too." As Miguel spoke about his passion for wildlife, especially snakes, Weber noticed the boy's intelligence shining through despite the language barrier. The businessman asked about Miguel's schooling, and his mother's face fell slightly. She explained their situation, how they could barely afford the basic school fees, let alone any extra books or supplies. "But Miguel is top of his class," she added quickly, a mother's pride evident in her voice. "The teachers say he has a gift for science." The driver translated, and Weber nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in their humble surroundings. The worn-out crates used as chairs, the patched umbrella providing shade for their fruit, the boy's shoes that were clearly too small for his growing feet. Weber pulled out his phone, but this time not for a business call. He showed Miguel pictures of the Munich Zoo's reptile house, explaining how he sat on the board of directors. Miguel's eyes grew wide as he saw the state-of-the-art facilities and the important conservation work being done there. "Do you know what a herpetologist is?" Weber asked through the driver. Before the translation was even complete, Miguel nodded enthusiastically. "It's my dream," he said in English, one of the phrases he'd learned from his precious magazines. "To study snakes, to protect them." The businessman then asked about Miguel's father, and a heavy silence fell over the stand. His mother softly explained that her husband had passed away 5 years ago, leaving them to manage on their own. Since then, it had been a daily struggle just to keep food on the table and Miguel in school. Weber listened intently, his expression growing more determined with each translated word. He had made his fortune in technology, but his true passion had always been wildlife conservation. In Miguel, He saw something familiar, that same burning curiosity and dedication he'd had as a young man, before life took him in a different direction. The driver, who had worked for Weber for years, could see the wheels turning in his employer's mind. He'd seen that look before, usually right before Weber made one of his famously bold business decisions. Something was about to happen. Tell them, Weber said to his driver, that what happened today wasn't just luck. This boy has a gift, and more importantly, he has passion. Ask them if they would be willing to meet with my lawyers tomorrow morning. As the driver translated, Miguel and his mother exchanged confused looks. Lawyers? Had they done something wrong? Weber, seeing their concern, quickly added, I believe in investing in potential. Today, this young man saved my life because of knowledge he taught himself from old magazines. Imagine what he could do with proper education and resources. Miguel's mother's eyes filled with tears as she began to understand what Weber was suggesting. Her son, however, was still focused on the pictures of the reptile house, asking questions about the different species they kept there, completely unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as Weber prepared to leave, but this was far from the end of the story. It was, in fact, just the beginning. The next morning arrived with a golden sunrise that seemed brighter than usual. Miguel had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the zoo pictures Weber had shown him. He was up early, helping his mother clean their small home for the 10th time, though it was already as spotless as their humble resources would allow. Just as the morning market was beginning to buzz with activity, a convoy of 3 black cars pulled up to their small house. Miguel's neighbors peeked through their windows, curious about such fancy vehicles in their simple neighborhood. Weber stepped out of the first car, wearing a fresh suit but looking more approachable than the day before. Behind him came 2 people carrying briefcases, his lawyers. Good morning, Weber said warmly in English, then nodded to his driver to translate everything that would follow. Miguel's mother invited everyone in, apologizing for their modest home. She had prepared coffee in their best cups, the ones usually saved for Christmas, and laid out the few chairs they owned. The lawyers opened their briefcases and began spreading papers across the family's small table. Through the driver's translation, they explained what Weber was proposing. The words they used were big and complicated, but the meaning was clear. Weber wanted to change Miguel's life. A full scholarship, the driver translated, all the way through university. Miguel's mother's hands flew to her mouth in shock. All expenses paid, books, uniforms, supplies, plus a living allowance for the family so Miguel can focus on his studies without worrying about helping at the fruit stand. Miguel, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. But why? He asked in his simple English. Weber smiled and responded through the driver. Because talent and passion like yours shouldn't go to waste. Yesterday, your knowledge saved my life. Tomorrow, it might save many more. The lawyers continued explaining the details. Miguel would start at the city's best private school next month. During holidays, he would have the opportunity to intern at various wildlife centers, including the Munich Zoo's reptile house. His mother would receive monthly support to cover their living expenses, and their house would be renovated to ensure Miguel had a proper place to study. As the driver translated each point, tears rolled down Miguel's mother's cheeks. She kept shaking her head in disbelief, looking between Weber and her son. This was the kind of miracle she had prayed for but never truly believed would come. There's one condition, Weber said, his face serious. Through the translator, he continued, you must promise to work hard and use this opportunity to fulfill your potential. This isn't charity. It's an investment in your future and in the future of wildlife conservation. Miguel sat up straighter in his chair. I promise, he said firmly, no translation needed. His mother hugged him tightly, her tears now flowing freely. The lawyers smiled as they started explaining where to sign the documents. While the adults handled the paperwork, Weber handed Miguel another gift. a brand new laptop loaded with educational software and digital subscriptions to wildlife journals. Miguel's hands trembled as he touched the sleek device, something he'd only seen through shop windows before. Outside, word had spread through the neighborhood. Their friends and neighbors had gathered, whispering excitedly about the mysterious cars and what this might mean for Miguel and his mother. The tale of how he had saved a rich man from a snake was already becoming local legend. As the morning wore on and more papers were signed, Miguel's mother served her precious coffee with shaking hands. She couldn't stop thanking Weber, who kept insisting that he was the one who should be grateful. Through it all, Miguel sat quietly, holding his new laptop, his mind already racing with thoughts of all the things he would learn. This was more than just a scholarship. It was a complete transformation of their lives, all because Miguel had followed his passion for learning about snakes, even when others thought it was strange. The changes in Miguel's life happened faster than anyone could have imagined. Within weeks, he found himself walking through the gates of St. Michael's International School, wearing a crisp new uniform that still had creases from the store. His old backpack had been replaced with a leather school bag that contained brand new books, notebooks, and his precious laptop. At first, the transition wasn't easy. The other students, mostly from wealthy families, whispered about the snake boy from the fruit stand. Some even made jokes about his slight accent when he spoke English. But Miguel didn't let it bother him. He was too busy soaking up knowledge like a sponge in the ocean. His new science teacher, Mrs. Chen, quickly became his biggest supporter. She had heard about how he saved Weber from the snake and was impressed by his self-taught knowledge. During lunch breaks, she would often find Miguel in the library, surrounded by biology books, taking careful notes in his neat handwriting. "You know," she told him one day, "most students your age are trying to avoid extra studying." Miguel looked up from his book about reptile conservation and smiled. "This isn't studying to me," he replied, his English improving daily. "This is what I love." Back home, things were changing too. Weber's promise of renovation had transformed their small house. They now had proper walls instead of wooden planks, a real roof that didn't leak when it rained, and most importantly for Miguel, a small study room with a desk and bookshelves. His mother had stopped selling fruit by the roadside. The monthly support from Weber's foundation meant she could finally rest her tired feet and focus on making their house a home. She had even started taking English classes at the community center, determined to understand the new world her son was entering. The neighbors who used to whisper about the strange boy who liked snakes now pointed him out proudly to visitors. "That's Miguel," they would say. "He saved a millionaire from a snake, and now he's going to become a doctor for animals." The story had become a source of inspiration for other children in the neighborhood, showing them that dreams could come true in unexpected ways. Every weekend, Miguel volunteered at the local wildlife rescue center. The head veterinarian there, Dr. Torres, had heard about his story and taken him under his wing. While other kids his age were playing video games, Miguel was learning how to handle injured animals, assist in basic treatments, and most importantly, educate visitors about wildlife conservation. "You have a gift," Dr. Torres told him one Saturday after Miguel had helped calm a frightened iguana. "It's not just about knowing facts from books. You understand animals in a way that can't be taught." Miguel beamed with pride, remembering how his mother used to worry about his interest in reptiles. During one of his regular video calls with Weber, Miguel shared his experiences at the wildlife center. Weber listened intently as the boy excitedly described helping to treat an injured python. "You see," Weber told him, "this is why I invested in your future. Passion like yours is rare." The most significant change, however, was in Miguel himself. He still had the same curious mind and kind heart, but now he walked with more confidence. His dreams no longer seemed like impossible fantasies. They were becoming clear goals, with a path laid out before him. One evening, as he sat at his new desk finishing his homework, his mother came in with a small package. Inside was a framed photo of their old fruit stand, taken the day before it was closed. To remind you, she said softly in English, practicing her new skills, where our blessing started. Miguel placed the photo on his desk, right next to his new computer. It was a perfect reminder that sometimes the biggest changes in life come from staying true to who you are, even when others don't understand. Word of Miguel's story began to spread beyond their small town. Local newspapers picked up the tale of the fruit seller's son who saved a millionaire from a snake, and how that moment had changed both their lives. But what really caught people's attention was what Weber did next. Inspired by Miguel's passion and success, Weber announced the creation of the New Horizons Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful: to find talented young people who, like Miguel, had extraordinary potential but lacked opportunities. The foundation would provide them with education and resources to pursue their dreams, especially in wildlife conservation. Miguel showed me something important, Weber explained during the foundation's launch event, where Miguel sat in the front row with his mother. Sometimes the greatest talents are found in the most unexpected places. We just need to give them a chance to shine. The local wildlife center where Miguel volunteered became the foundation's first major project. Weber's team transformed it from a small rescue facility into a modern wildlife education center. New facilities were built, including a state-of-the-art reptile house that Miguel helped design based on his growing knowledge. "Remember when you used to chase away snakes from Mrs. Paula's chickens?" his mother asked one day as they toured the new center. Miguel laughed, thinking about how far he'd come from those days. Now he was teaching other children about snake safety and conservation, sharing his knowledge in both Portuguese and English. The foundation's work began attracting attention from major conservation organizations. When a famous wildlife documentary maker visited the center, he was amazed by Miguel's deep understanding of reptiles. "You speak about them with such respect," the filmmaker said. "It's rare to find someone so young with such expertise." Miguel's grades at school continued to impress everyone. His English was now fluent, and he even started learning German, inspired by his regular video calls with Weber. The other students had stopped whispering about the snake boy. Now they came to him for help with biology projects and listened eagerly to his stories about working at the wildlife center. One day, a letter arrived that made Miguel's hands shake with excitement. The Munich Zoo, where Weber was on the board, had invited him to spend his summer vacation working alongside their reptile experts. His mother cried happy tears as she helped him pack for his first trip abroad. "You know what makes me most proud?" she told him the night before his departure. "Not the good grades or the fancy school. It's that success hasn't changed your heart. You're still my kind, humble Miguel, who loves teaching others about the animals everyone else fears." The foundation's impact spread through their community. Other children, inspired by Miguel's story, started showing interest in wildlife and conservation. The education center began offering free classes to local schools, teaching children about the importance of protecting nature. Weber, watching all of this unfold, knew he had made the right decision that day by the fruit stand. During one of his visits to check on the foundation's progress, he found Miguel teaching a group of young children about snake safety, using the same gentle, patient approach he had used to save Weber's life. "You've started something remarkable," Weber told him after the class. "This is bigger than just your story now. You're helping create a new generation of wildlife defenders." Miguel smiled, thinking about how a single moment with a snake had created such a ripple effect of positive change. Back home, Miguel's mother had transformed their renovated house into a kind of unofficial community center. Parents would come to ask her advice about their children's education, hoping to learn from her experience. "Dreams can come true," she would tell them, "but first you have to believe in them." 5 years had passed since that fateful day by the fruit stand. Now Miguel stood on a stage at an international wildlife conservation conference in Rio de Janeiro. At 17, he was the youngest speaker ever invited to give a presentation, but his reputation had grown far beyond his years. The huge screen behind him showed a photo of the old fruit stand where it all began. The audience, filled with scientists, conservationists, and students from around the world, listened intently as Miguel shared his story. His English was now perfect, his confidence clear, but his humble nature still shone through every word. People often asked me if I was scared that day. Miguel said, gesturing to the photo. Of course I was. But I was more scared of what would happen if I didn't act. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. In the front row, his mother wiped away tears of pride, sitting next to Weber, who had flown in specially for this moment. Miguel clicked to the next slide, showing the new wildlife education center that had grown from the small rescue facility where he first volunteered. This center has now educated over 10,000 children about wildlife conservation, he explained. But more importantly, it has taught them that their dreams matter, no matter where they come from. The presentation continued with photos of the many projects Miguel had been involved in. There was the snake safety program he developed for local schools, which had reduced snake-related incidents in the region by 70%. Then came pictures of his work at the Munich Zoo's reptile house, where he'd helped raise endangered species of snakes. But the real change, Miguel said, his voice full of emotion, happened in my community. He showed photos of local children attending classes at the education center, their eyes wide with wonder as they learned about wildlife. These children no longer grow up fearing snakes or killing them on sight. They understand now that every creature has its place in our world. Weber's New Horizons Foundation had grown too. Inspired by Miguel's success, it now supported hundreds of talented young people around the world. The foundation had built wildlife education centers in 5 countries, each one following the model that had worked so well in Miguel's hometown. 5 years ago, I was just a poor boy who liked snakes. Miguel continued, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. Today, I stand here as proof that knowledge, passion, and one person's belief in you can change everything. He glanced at Weber, who nodded encouragingly. The audience broke into applause as Miguel showed the final slide. A recent photo of him teaching at the education center, surrounded by eager young faces. This is my real achievement, he said. Not the awards or the research papers, but every child who learns to respect and protect our wildlife instead of fearing it. After the presentation, people crowded around Miguel, asking questions and congratulating him. Young students wanted to know how they could follow in his footsteps. Seasoned scientists praised his innovative approaches to wildlife education. Through it all, Miguel remained the same humble boy who had once sold fruit by the roadside. Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner, Weber raised his glass in a toast. To Miguel, he said, who reminded us all that the greatest investments we can make are in people who dare to care. Miguel's mother, now confident in her English, added, and to the snake that brought us all together. Everyone laughed, but Miguel grew thoughtful. You know, he said, that snake didn't just change my life. It started a chain reaction that's still growing. Every child we teach, every animal we save, every mind we open. It all started with that one moment. As the sun set over Rio de Janeiro, Miguel looked out at the city lights, thinking about how far he'd come from that dusty roadside stand. But more importantly, he thought about how far he still had to go. His journey, like the ripple effect of his actions that day, was far from over.